Hey, I'm Amanda with Grade Level Guru, and I'm going to show you how to read Where the Wild Things Are with your first or second grader and get the most out of story time. We're going to be looking at vocabulary development, how to integrate visual ideas, character development and character interactions, and identifying key ideas. First thing, your first or second grader might be reading this book independently. If they are, then one option for you is to have them read the book to you and ask them to ask you questions. One of the Common Core standards for reading for first and second grade is actually that a student should be able to ask who, what, when, where, why, and how questions. So if you don't want to do any of these questions I've prepared, just have your kid ask you the questions, and that is still going to increase their reading comprehension, critical thinking skills, all that. All right. All right, vocabulary development. First off, ask your first or second grader how the word mischief and the illustration helps explain to us what is happening. What does the word mischief tell us about what Max is up to? It's a super descriptive word. It's a good vocabulary word, and it very precisely describes what he is doing. So have your student explain how the word mischief is such a precise vocabulary word that it describes what he's doing, how he is up to no good, nailing things into the walls of his home. All right, making some inferences. Here, I want you to ask your first or second grader, what is Max's mom calling him for? They never say in the book actually what she is calling him for, but there are lots of context clues both in the words and in the illustrations that she is probably calling him for dinner. So push your first or second grader to make that inference. Also, a good question here about character relationships is to notice how Max is getting along with his mom. He's got a grumpy face on, like they are not really getting along right now. Their relationship is very important because at the end of the book, it's going to completely change. So make sure your first and second grader is picking up on the fact that at the beginning of the book, Max is not really getting along with his mom. Another inference here, I want you to ask, do you really think the forest is growing in Max's bedroom? Like, what is actually happening here? Again, you got to use the context clues. He was sent to bed without dinner. It is nighttime. You see the stars and the moon there. So have your kid make some logical guesses, some logical inferences using the context about what is actually happening. He's probably dreaming, or he's probably just really using his imagination. But no, there is not literally a forest growing in his room. Interpreting words and phrases. The language here is very fancy. It would be figurative language for an older student, but first or second grader does not need to know what figurative language is. Just call it fancy language and call attention to it. I'm going to actually read it. So these words say, in and out of weeks and almost over a year to where the wild things are. That is a very dreamy way of describing the time that it's taking Max to get to where the wild things are in his dream. In and out of weeks and almost over a year. That is not a normal way to say that it took a long time. So I want you to ask, how do you ask your student about this? Ask them, what words or phrases seem to have a fancy meaning? So what words here sound fancy and super descriptive to you? And what do you think it means? And I think this is a harder question to ask a first or second grader, but how do these fancy words make the experience of reading the story more powerful? It kind of makes it wistful and dreamy, and it kind of pulls you into the whole feeling of the story that we're going to this fantasy place in his dream. But yeah, so how do these fancy words help you experience the text in a more powerful way? How does it draw you in? Over here, Interpreting words. Oh yes, Nash, the word Nash. So there's nothing in the pictures that are going to help you understand what the word Nash means. But we've got this word here. Ask your first or second grader, can you picture what the wild things are doing when the words say they gnashed their terrible teeth? Does gnash sound like a good thing? Does it sound like a bad thing? At least get a feeling for what the word gnash means. The connotation, the negative connotation that the word gnash has. Over here, describing characters in detail. The question for your first grader or second grader, how do the words help us understand what Max and the wild things are like? So they're gnashing their terrible teeth, they have terrible yellow eyes, and what Max does is he casts a spell on them and he says, be still. And the wild things are so taken aback, they call him the most terrible thing of all. So how does this help us understand what Max is like? He's brave. He's not scared of the wild things. And the wild things, of course, are scary at first. All right, lots of little details happening here, which is why we've got identifying what the text says explicitly. A question for your second grader, what were the wild things frightened of? Why were the wild things frightened and call Max the wildest thing of all? Why were they afraid of him? The text explicitly says why they're afraid of him. It's easy to overlook. It says it's because he said, be still, and tamed them with his magic trick. That caused them to be scared. Another detail that is easy to look over is exactly how did Max become king? It's easy to look at this page and just be like, he's king, okay, cool, move on. But the text does explicitly say how he became king. It says they were frightened and called him the most wild thing of all, and that is why they crowned him king. So identifying explicitly what the text says, important things, but they're details that are just easy to gloss over. Good, I thought maybe my microphone wasn't on, but it's on. Great, question for your second grader, character interactions. How are Max and the wild things with each other after Max has crowned king? It's kind of a question you got to look at the next page for, but what is their relationship like? How are they getting along? They're having a party, they're getting along great, okay? But it's important to understand that Max is getting along great with the wild things, because remember at the beginning of the story, he was not getting along great with his mom. And we've got, integrating ideas presented visually. The next 3 pages have 0 words. So your first and second graders got to be able to look at these pictures and understand what is happening to the plot, what is happening to the characters, what is happening in the story, only by looking at the pictures. But we want to ask them in a more complicated way. So ask them, what role do the illustrations play in describing characters, the plot, and the setting? So how can we tell what is going on? What role do these pictures play in advancing the plot and advancing the story? These pictures tell us that they are getting along great. They're having fun, they're having a party. I think this is the wild Rompus. He's got his crown and his scepter. So these pictures add to identifying the relationship Max has with the wild things and how they just are having a great time, getting along great, they're best friends. But this is the turning point in the story because Max is actually sad. So analyze character interactions. They had a great time, but why is Max sad? Ask your child, why does Max's behavior change from the beginning to the end of the story? He was having a great time. He was not having a great time with his mom. He was having a great time with the monsters. So why does his behavior change? It says in the text that he wanted to go back to the people who loved him the most. The wild things love him, but he wants to go back to the people who loved him the most. So that is why his behavior is changing. Big turning point in the story. We're starting to get to the central idea, the theme, the life lesson of this book. Analyzing point of view. How does Max leaving the wild things, even when they say they love him, show that Max show what Max is thinking and feeling. So Max's actions, he leaves. How do his actions show the reader what he is thinking and feeling? He's thinking that he wants to go back to his family because they love him the most. And he's feeling lonely because he's not around them. All right, he goes back. Analyzing character development. What, if anything, has Max learned by the end of the story? He's probably learning something about how he loves his family, even when his family annoyed him and didn't let him play and sent him to bed without dinner. He loves his family because he went back to them. What's the turning point where the character understands something? I guess just after he starts missing them. The party's over and then he's like, oh, I'm lonely. I wish I had my family here, the people who love me the most. So Max at the beginning versus the end, he's gone from being like annoyed with his family. They're not letting him play in the house. They're sending him to bed without dinner. He's being a little unruly, a little rebellious, like when he turns his bedroom into a jungle. But at the end, he's come around because he wanted to go back to his family. And you can see they left him food here. So even though he was unruly, they still show that they love him because they left him food for when he wakes up. So we got to ask, what lesson does the author want Max to learn from the story? What lesson does the author want us to learn from the story? This is about unconditional family love. How even if we are unruly and we don't get along, that in a family you still have unconditional love for each other. That is the big life lesson of the book, Where the Wild Things Are. All right, at the end of this book, you can have your kid give you a summary. If your kid is in a second grade, I would push them to give a more detailed summary, like what happens specifically at the beginning, what happens specifically in the middle, and what happens at the end. Because as a second grader, they should be starting to understand plot structure. Like there's certain things that are supposed to happen in the beginning of the story, certain things in the middle, certain things at the end. So try to get them to chop it up and get that plot structure as a second grader. And that is it. I hope you got some ideas how to get more out of story time with Where the Wild Things Are. Thank you to Tversky and Burke for helping me write these Common Core aligned questions. Like, subscribe, follow, share, all the things, and thank you.